how do you know how much yarn to use for a project? How do you make sure the fit is going to be absolutely perfect? How do you make sure that when you have an idea for a knitted garment that you can turn that vision into a reality? How to choose your yarns, what do you need, how to fix dropped stitches and those mistakes, or when something didn't turn out how you had envisioned. All of these things are going to be revealed in this video. These are going to be some tips and knitting hacks for beginners, or if you've been knitting for a long time, I'm sure you're going to find some valuable insights in this video that I'm going to be sharing with you. This is a big one, a insightful one, and I'm going to try to put as many links and tips in the description below as well, and you can use the YouTube chapter feature if you have a specific thing that you're looking for, so go ahead and check out the description for that. That is Viggo going crazy with Luna and Viggo have been at it the entire morning. They're just fighting or playing. I'm not always sure which one is which. He just managed to pull down the blinds. I don't know how he managed to do that. Viggo, are you trying to steal my show with all this commotion there? Okay, let's open these. I think it's a while because he hasn't gotten that much food this morning because we're out and I need to go to the grocery store to get some more, but I need to film this video before that because it gets so dark so quickly, so I only have like a couple of hours. So, and I mean, he's been fed, don't get me wrong, he's been fed a lot. He could just eat all day long, but I think maybe that's why he's having this little display of craziness. This video, I really tried to compile the things that I feel that every knitter should know. And I have been knitting since I was, I think, 5 years old, so that is 28 years. So there has been lots of trial and error, and right now I am super excited about knitting, and I am working on lots of knitting projects that will soon be revealed and I'll talk more about. Okay, let's get into the video. The first tip is to learn how to spot your knit stitches and your purl stitches. Now, mostly when you are knitting, you will be knitting in stockinette stitch. So that is when you knit on one side and then you purl the other side. And that creates this stockinette stitch, which is called. And if you knit in the round, you will just knit every row. Now, if you're following a pattern, for example, and you're making a rib knit, so that would be that you knit one and you purl one and you knit one and you purl one, and then on the other side, for every knit stitch, you purl those stitches, and for every purl stitch, you knit that stitch. So really kind of the basic and very simple stitches. And then if something suddenly doesn't look like it's supposed to look according to the pattern and there are some mistakes and then it makes it so much easier to fix it and understand what's going on if you know the difference between the knit stitch and the purl stitch. And how do you know this? Well, a knit stitch looks a bit like a V. So one stitch, so when you have that one loop and when you knit it, you can already see that it forms a little bit of a V shape. And that is how you know that is one stitch that you made, so that one loop. And when you've knitted that, that looks like a V. And then the purl stitch, on the other hand, that looks a little bit like a bump. So that is how you can tell if it's going to be a purl stitch or a knit stitch. So for example, if you're doing a ribbing and you're not sure, like, oh, did I just purl or did I just knit? Just look for, is it a V shape or is it a little bit of a bump shape? And this is going to help you so much and save you so much time and confusion. Trust me. The second tip is something that I have been struggling with a lot, and a lot of you also seem to have been struggling with, which is nice edges. When you're knitting, for example, something in the flat, it's going to be maybe a blanket or a a dishcloth, or something where you just want to have a neat edge. Because often the edge will be all wonky and some stitches are much looser, some are really tighter. And I actually found this super helpful video on this from Nimble Needles, and I'll link that in the description below. But essentially, and he goes like super detailed into it, but essentially what he said is that really to pay attention with that last stitch. So when you come to the last row or last stitch on a row, to make sure that you don't pull it out and you don't stretch it out to keep your needles or your yarn on the needles, really at the tip of them, and make just sure, like, to pay a little bit extra careful attention to not stretch it out. And same goes for that first stitch of the row, to not stretch it out, and be really, really mindful that you knit it really evenly and with even tension. And even tension, this brings us to our third point, how to get your tension to be more even. So when you're knitting, everything plays into what your knitted fabric will actually look like. So how tight you're holding the yarn, how you're holding the needles, what type of yarn, what type of needles you're using. All of this plays into how nice and neat and how even your tension will be. So I thought I'd share some tips that I found helpful, and I also looked around the internet a little bit for some other tips that some other knitters shared in getting your tension more even. So probably the first one would be to just practice. I mean, knitting, it is a very motorical skill, so the more you do it, the more even your tension will be, because you'll just be more comfortable with it. And one thing actually I've seen like new knitters do, and this makes a lot of sense, is that you hold everything very tight and you're kind of not relaxed. So I would say one of the key things is to try to relax into it and try to not like tighten it. Well, I mean, you have to kind of find your own tension, but not tighten it too much. I think that is one of the things, so that you're first very loose and then you tighten it a lot. But some other things that I've found helpful, at least, is also trying out what kind of needles you like and what feels good for you, because I think it's all about finding the thing that feels intuitively good for you. So I prefer to work with wooden needles, but you might prefer to work with these kind of stain needles or plastic needles. There are lots of different materials, and I will say that with different types of yarn, different needles sometimes feel better. So for example, these steel needles with very kind of slippery yarn, like something like a mohair yarn, that might not be so great because they can be very slippery, so then you'll have a hard time keeping your stitches on the needle. But maybe for a more bulky yarn that feels kind of not so great to work with, maybe you want a needle that has that kind of slippery slide just to make it a smoother experience. And then one more thing is how you hold the needles. So let me show you a little trick. So let me just show you a little tip on how to get more even tension when you're knitting. So and I knit continental style, when you're knitting, when you're taking the yarn, try to keep this and this needle at the same angle. So when you go in, try to keep it at all times at the same angle. So what you're doing is, when you go in, you use this hand, or if you're doing the English style, this hand, to wrap the yarn, and then you go out. So don't do, that you go in and then you do all kinds of funny movements and then you go out and then you will have stretched that stitch. So instead, and also try to keep your stitches quite close to the points of the needle, just to make sure that you don't put any extra tension or weird twists and pulls on your stitches, and that will help. Also, how you hold your yarn. There are so many different ways, but I like to hold either so that I hold my yarn on my pinky finger and then I go through, and then just this way, so I get a little bit of tension. But depending a little bit on what I am knitting, sometimes I won't even do that. Sometimes I just hold it in my index finger and then I let it go through there, and then I just knit. So it depends a little bit on, there are lots of different ways, and I think it's all about finding the thing that works best for you and that you feel most comfortable with. Sun is almost going down already. It's crazy. Like at the moment, at 3 p.m., it's already dark in here. All right, but we're gonna move on. The next tip is to use stitch markers. generously. So stitch markers, they can come in many different sizes, in colors, and you can get them from like craft stores, or you could just use safety pins. But essentially the idea is with stitch markers that you can place them, for example, when you've done an increase or a decrease, you can put a little stitch marker there so that you know, and you can find that increase or decrease later. And you can also, it just helps when you're counting rows and maybe you get like confused, like, oh no, how many rows did I have? Then when you have that little marker placed in those strategic places, it will just help it and will just also become much quicker to do. So I definitely encourage you to use stitch markers generously, and you can make your own, or you can use little pieces of thread. It doesn't have to be the stitch markers that you get from a shop, but that just helps a lot. Next, I wanted to share a little bit of a pro tip on how to make sure that the thing you're knitting will actually fit you and that it will have that really nice fit that you like. So I, as you know, design most of my knitwear myself. And even if you don't design your knitwear yourself from scratch, but you use patterns, maybe you want to make some alterations, or maybe you have some really specific things. Like in my experience, most of us have some really specific things that we like for our body types. So for example, I like a long sleeve. I also like these kind of balloon sleeves. I like it to be a little bit oversized. One really helpful thing that I've often done is that I've used an existing garment. So one of my favorite knitwears or garments that I have in my in my closet, and they could even be store-bought garments, and then I take the measurements from that garment to see what their measurements are and how I prefer it to be. So this is one that I really like. I like the fit of it, I like the length of it. So then I've used that as a guide, because sometimes I find that just taking your own measurements doesn't really tell you anything. I mean, sure, when you're doing a pattern, it's good to know your own measurements, but when you're designing something, it's actually more useful knowing what the measurements are on an existing garment that you would like to incorporate into your new knitted thing to get that fit. And then obviously then if you would start to design something from scratch, the way you would do it, you would take all the kind of crucial measurements. So, you know, bust circumference, you would take the circumference of the sleeves and the cuff, and also shoulder to hem length. And then you would have those measurements, and then next is that you would do a gauge swatch. So you would knit a little bit of sample in the needles and the yarn that you're planning to use. And then it's really mathematics and trying to see how you will get that same measurements with that gauge. So for example, if you have, let's say on 10 centimeters, you get 20 stitches and you want to have the circumference of the body is going to be, well, just now for simplicity's sake, 100 centimeters, you would need to have 200 stitches for the body to get that 100 centimeters, to get that nice oversized or whatever the look is that you're going for. I think that makes sense, right? And if this didn't make sense to you, then don't worry and just let's go to the next tip. Next tip, how much yarn will you need for a project? So sometimes it's hard to estimate how much yarn you need when you're in a yarn shop or you're shopping for yarn online for a project. And my tip is that if you are in a yarn shop, you can always ask the people who work there for advice. They're usually very knowledgeable in knitting, but maybe if you're shopping online, maybe you don't know. And you know, for obviously goes without saying, for a sweater, you're going to be needing more yarn than for, say, a pair of socks. And if you are knitting from a pattern, in a pattern, it will usually always state how much yarn you're going to be using. And it would either say it in how many balls or how many skeins of that yarn for each size. So you just need to figure out which size you're gonna knit, and then you know approximately how many, or you'll know exactly according to the pattern, how many balls of yarn you'll need. A little maybe heads up is that it's always good if you're, for example, choosing like a hand-dyed yarn or a limited edition, or you're going to a place that you know you're not going to be able to come there again, to get a little bit extra yarn. Because I have had projects that I've almost finished and then I run out of yarn, and maybe it's only like I need a couple of more grams to finish it because maybe I knitted looser or I did some alterations. You know, things happen on the way. So it's just good to have always a little bit extra, especially if you're using like some kind of special yarn. Now, Some other patterns will say it in grams instead, and sometimes even in meters. And how you know then how much yarn or how many balls or skeins you're gonna using is that on every yarn it says how many grams and then how many meters that is. So for example, if you are knitting a sweater and it says that you need 300 grams of this particular yarn, then when you go to the yarn shop, you know that if that yarn comes in balls of 50 grams, you need 6 skeins of that yarn. But what if you're not knitting with that exact yarn that is recommended in the pattern? Then just go and look for a similar type of yarn that has a similar type of meter or yardage for that gram, and that is how you'll know that it's going to be approximately the same thickness. Or if you want to substitute yarn, you could instead, if you want to use a fingering weight or like a, not lighter, like a smaller, not smaller, a thinner yarn, then you can, for example, use 2 threads instead. But always, remember to do those swatch gauges, so you do a little sample so that you see that you get the proper gauge for that pattern, so you don't end up with a size, extra large if you were trying to do a size medium. Tip number 7 is to choose a lighter color when you're working with textures. I think when you're doing cables and lace, I always try to choose a lighter color because I just think it looks way more gorgeous and it just shows off the texture more. So instead of choosing I would not probably do a very textured project in this dark color because you're just not gonna be able to see it so much. And tip number 8 is if you're doing color work, to choose colors that have a bit more contrast than maybe what looks good when you're just holding them next to each other. Because I have at least noticed that when I've done projects with really nice colors that were quite similar in color, so they didn't have that much contrast between them, usually when you then put them together in a color work pattern, you can't really tell, or it just doesn't look so good, would say, because you probably need a little bit more contrast. And I feel colors, they kinda, when you just look at them like this, you just hold the ball of yarn, they somehow look more vibrant than when you then combine them into a knit project, and suddenly they can look very different and kind of look a little bit murkier. So that is one little tip if you're gonna plan some Fair Isle project or where you have lots of different colors, to just be extra mindful that you have enough contrast between them so that you can actually see then that pattern. All right, I have to include this one in here, making a sample swatch. And I know this is something that so many knitters, they just kind of, they don't do it. You don't have enough patience or time, or you feel like, I just want to go start knitting. And I have been there too, and trust me, I know that feeling, but there are so many reasons to make a sample swatch, just to test out your gauge and check out the texture and how it's going to look, and maybe you then want to make some tweaks, maybe it's not looking as you had hoped, and then it would be a pity that you've already knitted, spent hours and hours on something, and then you realize like, oh, actually this is way too small, this is way too big, doesn't look like how I wanted to. So I just recommend to make a little simple swatch, and if you're making or knitting from a pattern, you can usually see it will says gauge, so, and then how many stitches and how many rows you need to create 10 centimeter or 4-inch little swatch. So usually if there, for example, you would say the gauge would be 18 stitches and 25 rows, you could do a swatch that is, for example, 24 or 26 stitches and 30 rows to make sure that it's just bigger than that gauge size, to make sure that you have the same gauge. I wanted to quickly jump in here and say thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this part of the video. I have worked with Skillshare before, and they are an online learning platform with thousands of inspiring and creative classes in things like photography and video editing. They even have classes in knitting there, project management, animation, illustration, creative writing, and I have been taking full advantage of their huge library. And at the moment, as I talked before, I am working on this knitting book, so it's like a pretty big project. Oh, that is my printer starting to make funny noises. Okay, I think it stopped. I've been struggling a little bit with just time management and keeping track of all the things that I have to keep track of. So I went into Skillshare and tried to search for some project management classes, and I found a really good one. It's called Project Management in Real Life, Simple Workflows to Achieve Your Goals. and it's by Nikki Henderson, who is a marketing copywriter at Asana. And that is perfect because I'm actually using Asana, so it's like an app for managing your project. And she gives some really good tips and just breaks it down, like the steps for the ultimate project management experience, if you can call it that. And well, I'm not the most organized person, but I'm trying to be more organized, to try to not be so stressed and overwhelmed by all the tasks and just have everything in my head and actually try to get it out into this app or into a calendar. So if you'd like to check out that class or some of the other classes on Skillshare, you can click the link in the description below, and then you will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, and you can explore all the classes they have in there. So just go and click the link in the description below if you feel like it. All right, back to the video. Okay, now we're coming to some really specific little tips, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly to make sure that your finished garment just looks a little bit extra pro. And one of them is that when you're doing your rib knit hems and edges, so those are usually found at the hem or on the collar, or if you're doing a cardigan at the front edges, I recommend to go down 2 needle sizes. So that's 2 European needle sizes. So I'll try to link and find what that means in the US, but 2 needle sizes instead of 1 needle size, because then the needle size you're going to use for the rest of the project, I should say. Because I've often found that when you just use a needle size that goes 1 size down, I knit pretty loosely, and usually then the rib is actually not kind of tightening up, and it actually flares out more. And I really want my knits, the ribs, to be pretty tight, and so that they actually kind of cinch it all together a little bit. And another tip is to, when you do your rib hems, to actually knit all the knit stitches through the back loop, because that also will create this twisted effect and it just becomes more defined, and I think it looks a little bit more pro. Okay, tip number 11, another little pro tip to make sure that your garments look a little bit more high fashion than fast fashion or regular fashion. I don't know, but they just take it to that little bit of a different level, is to fold the collar double. I've spoken about this before, but I just think it's such a nice little trick. So instead of just leaving it single, you fold it double. So you would instead knit double the size, and then you just fold it and you attach on the inside. And I just love the look of that, and I just think it looks a little bit more like pro, a little bit more expensive. It has that little bit like extra touch. Okay, the next tip is one that I see quite often when I'm browsing on Pinterest or Instagram, or just like seeing what people are making, is that make sure that your sleeves aren't too short. And of course, this is now a matter of taste, and this is now my personal taste kind of. But I love when the sleeves are instead a little bit longer. I just feel like that gives a more feminine and flattering vibe. Of course, if you're doing a 3/4, is that how you say it? 3/4 fit, then of course this doesn't apply. But if you're doing a full length cardigan or sweater, I would recommend to try to make sure that they are a little bit longer and on the longer side instead of on the shorter side. Now, granted, of course, sometimes with sleeves, they can grow a little bit, so do take that into account. But I don't know, I just wanted to include this and kind of make a point out of this, because I at least find that when they are a little bit longer, like with this one, I've just worn it so much. And also it's nice when then it's cold, you can just fold up the sleeves. Okay, now comes, if you've been doing something else, then please come back to me, because this is super, super important. When you are knitting, please make notes as you go along. I cannot tell you how many times I've knitted a project just kind of spontaneously, or I've started to maybe knit from a pattern, but then I tweaked it or I changed some things. And I just think like, yeah, I'm gonna remember this. I don't have to make notes. Yeah, I'll make a note in the evening or when I get back home or whatever. And a few months go by and I come back to the project and maybe I want to do something similar, or I'm thinking about designing something, and I don't have any notes, and I have no idea what size needle I used, how many balls of yarn I used. Like, it's just all poof gone. Like, you would be amazed, or at least I am, every time I think that I'm going to remember. But of course, I don't remember anything, so please make notes as you go along. I often use my phone. I will just put either in a Google Docs or then just in the Notes app, just make a few notes. How many stitches did I cast on? What size needle did I use? How many strands of yarn? Try to keep track of how much yarn I used for that project, etc., etc., and you will thank yourself in the future. No. Oh my god, I have dropped a stitch. Everything is ruined. I have to go back to the beginning. No. Of course not. Oh, hello, Vigo. When this happens, so you might be dropping a stitch. So basically, the stitch has now unraveled itself. There is a really quick and easy way to fix this without having to unravel or do some kind of weird stuff. So let me show you a really easy way to pick up this dropped stitch. Oh my god, Vigo, stop. Okay, so right here you can see that this stitch has been dropped. 2 stitches have dropped. So these threads here are the stitches that were dropped, and here you can see the stitches kind of barely hanging on to its bare life. So for this, you might want to use a crochet hook. That helps a little bit, but you can also do it without the crochet hook. So let me start by showing you how to do it without the crochet hook if you don't have that, and then you can also do the crochet hook. So I'm just gonna go back to and find that spot where we can see that there is a loop, so that's stitch, and then I'm just gonna put it onto my needle. So I just put my right needle into it, and here I see that there are these threads running behind. So I know that these are the stitches that have dropped, and you can see this is the first one. So all I have to do is I use my right needle, go through that in the stitch, and then I just kind of gently grab that strand of yarn and thread it on or through that loop to get my stitch back on. And then I do the same with the second strand of yarn, just like that, et voila. So we have our stitch back. And then you can just transfer it back onto the left needle and continue knitting. Back in business, baby. And similarly, if this would happen on a purl stitch row, so let's say this stitch has now dropped. Dropped stitch. Then all you need to do is just catch that yarn so that it's in front. So when we're on the other side, we have the yarn behind here. Now we'll have it in the front instead to pick up that purl stitch, like so. And then again, you're good to go. Oh, the sun came out again. Okay, the last tip is to, contrary to common opinion out there, I think it's okay to not finish every project and only be working on one project at a time. I think it's okay to have many projects at the same time in progress, because even though I get the idea of, not casting on and just starting project here and there and buying new yarn and like it becomes this kind of consumption frenzy again, I understand the idea behind that, and also the idea that you want to finish one project before you start the next one. But when I think about it more and more, I go through these phases where I have so many ideas and I just want to start new projects. And then I have also phases where I just want to knit and I don't maybe have that many ideas, or I'm not that inspired to try on new things. And then I just want to have something to knit. So in those moments, I think it's nice that I have then many different projects that I can choose from. And when I think about knitting and making things by hand, I feel like the point is not that you should kind of force yourself to just do one thing and be kind of very, how can I say, pragmatic about it almost. I think it's nicer to allow yourself that freedom and the joy of trying out things. And when you have an idea oh, I wonder how that would look, go for it and try it out and just allow that freedom and joy. So that is an idea that I wanted to share with you, because I see a lot of people online being I'm trying to finish all my knits in progress before I cast on anything new. And I'm just thinking but why? Of course, go ahead. I think it's nice to also finish projects sometimes, because we all know that the cupboards and the closets can get filled with halfway projects very quickly, and I think everybody goes through that, but I think it's also part of the process. I think you need to have those projects that maybe you will never finish, and maybe you learn something from that. It was an idea that didn't work out. I mean, with all art and when you are creating stuff, we all know that not everything can be a hit. That I think, you know, any artist would tell you that that's just not how it works. So just to be, you know, more kind of allowing for that process. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're still here with me, let me know in the comment below, and maybe we could put like a little secret, like maybe put the emoji, like the pineapple emoji, and then I know that you stuck until the end. I've seen other YouTubers do that, and I think it's really nice, like little kind of secret, like, oh, there's the pineapple emoji, this person watched the video till the end. So if you comment, then put the pineapple emoji in there. Why the pineapple? I don't know, it was just the first thing that came to mind. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, then I would love for you to subscribe and support me in this knitting video journey that I'm going on right now. I'm taking you with me, and you can come and say hi. I'm over at Kotobakika on Instagram as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's something that you're wondering about, put a comment. Yeah, put it in a comment in the description below, and I always try to, like, not maybe every day, but I try to always keep a track of the comments and reply as well. So let me know and I will be sure to answer, or sometimes somebody else has really good tips and they will answer it. So I really like that community vibe under these videos. All right, thank you so much for watching, and take care, and I will see you the next time. Ciao!